Hi there folks, Roz here from Books from My Bookshelf, and it's that time of the year again. It's time for a spooky book list in time for Halloween. I asked the question last week whether you wanted the Halloween list now or later, and you have spoken, so here it is. Now, I have got 10 stories for you in today's list. Now, this is the third time I've done a Halloween list now, and I try not to repeat the same books every year, but there'll always be a 2 or 3 maybe that will be repeated, and one in particular that has to go on a spooky list. But there's a few in here that I've not mentioned before, and not all of you like your novels to be too dark and scary. So I've also included maybe 1 or 2 here that are a little bit lighter, a lighter shade of dark perhaps than some of the others. I've also included 1 short story and in fact 1 children's novel for those of you with children or grandchildren, etc. So I hope there's something in here to please all of you. Before we go any further, of course, we have to have an appearance by Tilly, my little co-star, who always makes an appearance in my videos, and I think she rather likes being a little star. So let's get started on this list. Now, my first on my list, because as usual, I always do these in chronological order of publication. The first on my list is the short story, and it was published in 1866, and it's by Charles Dickens. And this is The Signalman. Now, this time last year, for Halloween, I actually did a reading of this short story, and if you'd like to have a look at that and listen to the whole story, I will put a link to that up here for you. Now, The Signalman is a very chilling tale, and it's told through a narrator who actually visits the signalman and hears his story, so it partly comes kind of second hand. But the signalman himself, he's on this sort of quiet part of the railway track just before a tunnel entrance, and he starts getting strange phantom warnings of danger, where his bell rings and he sees something that can't be explained. And soon after these strange visions, happenings, a terrible accident or disaster happens on the rail. And this continues, this happens several times. And the mystery and the tension grows throughout the story and leads up to an ending which is also very chilling and mysterious. I won't go into the ending much at all, but it does leave the reader with a question and a feeling of chills down the back of your neck. What Dickens does with this story is quite clever, because the narrator who interviews the signalman at one point doesn't believe that anything supernatural is happening. He just thinks that the signalman is maybe overworked and is having hallucinations. So of course that means that this poor signalman isn't really being believed, and he is thoroughly convinced that these warnings, this bell rings where nobody else seems to hear it, and these seem to be presentiments of some danger or terrible event. So we get those two juxtaposition of those two attitudes towards what is happening. And then, of course, what happens at the end tends to make us feel that the signalman was right all along. But at the end of the story, as I say, the question is left for the reader to answer. But it's a great, chilling, suspenseful story, and I do hope, if you've never read it or heard it, I think at one point it was adapted for television and it's been on the radio as well. But yeah, go and listen to my reading of it if you're interested in finding out what that story is all about. Next on my list is another 19th century novel, and this is Oscar Wilde this time, and it's The Picture of Dorian Gray. This is the story of the man who basically sells his soul in return for eternal youth and beauty. And he has a portrait painted, and he is a young, very good looking young man, but he gets drawn into a very corrupt life, a double life, while he remains on the outward appearance to be a gentleman, but secretly indulging in all kinds of corrupt and evil practices. And of course, he remains still beautiful and young, but his portrait begins to bear the marks of his deeds. And as time goes on, he still retains his beauty, while the portrait becomes uglier and uglier and more evil looking. Such a fascinating story, draws upon some of the beliefs during the Victorian period. It was a widespread, commonly thought idea known as physiognomy, that an individual's appearance reveals his character. And of course, in The Picture of Dorian Gray, this only happens to the portrait. So this idea of this man leading this double life, while just appearing to be such a lovely character because he is beautiful, really turns that on its head. Now, it's also interesting in terms of being a very sort of gothic, dark novel, in that the only supernatural thing that happens in the novel is the change in the painting itself, because, that can't happen. But that is the only thing, weird thing that happens. And it doesn't really affect us as the reader. It's not like a really scary novel in that sense, where we ourselves feel chilled. It does, though, affect the people in the novel, particularly Dorian Gray himself, as his picture gets worse and worse. And it also affects those around Dorian Gray. But it's not, because it's such a personal thing, it's not like a really, I don't think of it as a very scary novel, but it's the psychological effects that are quite chilling. And of course, and the people around Dorian Gray begin to realise that something very strange is happening as well. It also has quite a lot of homosexual undercurrents. There's a lot of intimacy suggested between several of the characters. And very sadly, this book was actually used in evidence 5 years after its publication, when Oscar Wilde went on trial, obviously believing that some of those scandalous acts committed in the book were taken from Wilde's own life. So the book has got that kind of shadow over it as well, sadly. But it's just a fascinating kind of, although it has that supernatural element, it's much more of a chilling psychological story than like a ghost or other kind of horror story. So psychological, dark stories, if you're up for that, then yes, that's one for you. Now, my next book, published in 1997, is the one that I will always have on my Halloween list because for me it is the archetypal horror story, and it's Bram Stoker's Dracula, of course. Now, I've said a lot about this book in the past, particularly the long opening sequence of Jonathan Harker's journey to and across Transylvania until his meeting with Count Dracula in that wonderfully gothic castle. Of course, the story is that Harker goes to visit Count Dracula because Dracula has asked him to help him find a house to live in England, in London. But while Harker is at Dracula's castle, some very strange events begin to occur, and Harker has that slow creeping feeling of something being not right, and it's the slowness of this realization that something is very strange that really creates the chilling feeling in this novel. And I love that slowness. It just kind of creeps up on you. And of course, when Dracula arrives in England, soon after that, very odd events start to happen in England. That wonderful scene of the shipwreck, and then the marks on the woman's neck, and it gradually begins to be realized exactly who and what Dracula is. And so the group of friends determine to try and stop him. But I wanted to, rather than talk about the actual story, as I'm sure most of you know, and, to try not to repeat myself too much, I thought I'd read a little bit from the introduction, which puts the novel in historical context and its place among other novels of the time. So bear with me. For me personally, I just find this kind of thing really, really interesting, and I hope you do too. So this is from the introduction of this edition, which is the Penguin Classics edition, published in 1993. Bram Stoker's novel was not the only production of the late 19th century to register a feeling that some gigantic evil was gnawing away at Christian self-confidence. An enormous appetite existed in the last quarter of the century for crime, ghost, and horror stories. These imaged various kinds of social and psychic terror into existence, only to impose upon them closures often invoking radical forms of order and sometimes the law, though these might be coded in unconventional ways. It was the age of Conan Doyle's immensely popular cocaine imbibing, analytically minded super sleuth Sherlock Holmes and his evil but equally analytical adversary Moriarty. In order to imagine the possibility of vampires existing in our scientific, matter-of-fact 19th century, Van Helsing in the novel has to teach his ex-pupil Dr. Seward that tradition and superstition are everything, a sentiment that clearly interested Stoker himself. Robert Louis Stevenson created in 1886 a scientist diabolically caught between gentlemanly propriety and experiments in lust with the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In the London streets of the late 1880s, there was, of course, a real terror abroad in the shape of Jack the Ripper, whose revolting acts of blood against women brought to the excited fancy of one East End newspaper reporter images of ghouls, vampires, and bloodsuckers. And he also goes on to talk about a painting by one of the pre-Raphaelites, Burne-Jones, called The Vampire. And also, of course, the works of H.G. Wells. And, of course, we've also just seen Oscar Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray. So all these works of literature and art appearing in this very last part of the 19th century. Really fascinating, as it reflects maybe fears and, as the introduction suggests, some xenophobia in the British psychology at that time. So I hope you find that interesting. It just goes to show how waves of certain ongoing social ways of thinking is reflected in literature and art of the time. But leaving this with these wonderful books to read that just give us a nice chill when we're reading something at Halloween. So I just love Dracula. It's so well written. It's very scary if you like to be scared a little while you're sitting cosily in your living room. And of course, talking of other books written at that time, I will be uploading very soon my reading of Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That will be coming up in the next week or two. Now, my next book on the list, quite timely, because we've just been talking in that introduction I just read out, we've just been talking about Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes series. And my next book is actually the most gothic of all of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and that is The Hound of the Baskervilles, published in 1902. Now, I've never actually physically read the book of The Hound of the Baskervilles, but I have listened to the audio book. So I don't usually talk about books that I haven't actually read, but I do think listening to an audio book counts. And of course, I've seen many of the films and television productions of The Hound of the Baskervilles. While most of Sherlock Holmes is basically straightforward detective fiction, The Hound of the Baskervilles is much more darkly gothic with a supernatural feel. And of course, also, it's set on Dartmoor, which gives it even more gothic overtones, of course. So the story begins, as usual with Sherlock Holmes stories, when somebody comes to ask for Sherlock Holmes' aid in investigating a mysterious death. And he tells Holmes of a legend that has run in the Baskerville family of Devon when, during the 17th century, when Sir Hugo Baskerville kidnapped a farmer's daughter. But when she escaped, he ran after her, and he and the girl were later found dead. She seems to have died of fright, and Hugo appears to have been killed by some large hound. And that hound is said to have haunted Dartmoor ever since. And the legend goes that it had also been the cause of several of the Baskerville family's deaths. Now, one of the descendants of the Baskerville family, Sir Charles Baskerville, has now returned to the large house on Dartmoor. A man with a weak heart, but this is where the recent mysterious death comes in, because his dead body has now been found with a look of terrible horror on his face and large canine paw prints nearby. Now, of course, Sherlock Holmes, being a very rational, analytical person, doesn't believe in supernatural hound ghosts or anything of that nature, but he does decide to go down to Devon and try and investigate what is happening. And furthermore, they also discover that an escaped convict, a murderer, is also now loose somewhere on the moors, which gives you an added feeling of tension and threat. And there are more deaths, and it does have this very kind of claustrophobic, dark, chilling feeling, of course, set in the mists of Dartmoor. But we do know also, and I don't think I'm spoiling anything by saying this, because we do know with Sherlock Holmes, these basically are detective stories and are based on rational investigations and rational thought. We do know that eventually the supernatural aspect of this story will turn out to be something a little more material, shall we say, because it's a detective story, not a ghost story. But Conan Doyle brings in those aspects of the popular ghost story to give this particular novel a very creepy feel. And I think it's probably one of the best known and best loved of the Sherlock Holmes series. And I think probably because of that very popular at the time theme of the supernatural and legend and ghosts, that he has brought that into a Sherlock Holmes story. So both lovers of Sherlock Holmes and the lovers of the supernatural would both be attracted to this particular story. But it certainly does have very dark undertones, and if you're looking for something just creepy and gothic to read at Halloween, then I think you can't go far wrong with The Hound of the Baskervilles. Now, we're going to leave the late 19th and early 20th century behind us now and leap straight into the middle of the 20th century. And my next book is actually the one children's novel I've got on this list. Now, I wanted to put a children's novel in this list, but I wanted something that was from some time ago rather than more modern children's stories that I don't really know much about. And I thought back in my memory of any really creepy books that I read as a child, and one came to mind. I couldn't remember the title of it or the name of the author, so I had to do a Google search by kind of describing the plot, and I eventually found it. And I also found the cover that was on the book I read as a child, my Puffin Books edition, and this is it. It's called Marianne Dreams, and it's by Catherine Storr. I remember this book. It had quite a big effect on me, and it really stayed with me, and I read it at least 2 or 3 times, I think, since I really liked it. But it is creepy. It starts out, and this is totally from my memory. As far as I remember, it starts out with Marianne on her birthday, I think, being treated to first horse riding, pony riding lessons, and starting to feel ill. And this opening actually appealed to me because I think at the time I was having pony riding lessons myself. And also I remember that feeling of feeling ill on your birthday or on Christmas Day, and it's like the end of the world. But she actually ends up having a long illness, which means that she's bedridden for quite a long time. And while she's lying in bed, she starts to draw pictures. And then she finds that when she sleeps, she is dreaming inside the pictures that she has drawn. And one of these dream appearances is a boy called Mark, who is also in the dream world a long-term invalid. Marianne's illness gets worse, and the worse her illness gets, the more she begins to feel trapped in this dream world that she's kind of created. And what I remember the most creepiest thing about this novel was, I think at one point she gets very angry with her dream friend Mark, and she creates these sort of structures, these big stones. But when she sleeps and dreams, these stones, these things are getting closer. These are real, and they get closer. And it's really very scary. I mean, I'm just trying to remember this off the top of my head. And she tries to cross things out, but it just seems to make things worse. And there is this growing feeling that something bad will really happen if these things get that close to the house. So that is my children's book. It published in 1958, and I read it probably when I was about, I don't know, 8 or 9, something like that. It's very, very atmospheric and page-turny. Yes, I remember sitting up in bed and not wanting to turn the light out. But you know, if you're sort of interested in maybe reading this yourself, or maybe introducing the children in your life to some vintage children's stories, then I think that's a really good one for Halloween. Now, my next book is probably the one that is sort of the least creepy of all the novels on this list. So good for you if you don't like your Halloween reads too dark. But it is suspenseful, and this writer, was known at some point as the Queen of Suspense. And this is 9 Coaches Waiting by Mary Stewart. And I know quite a few of you have been great fans of Mary Stewart. I've read several of her books. At one point, just could not get enough of them. This edition, by the way, is actually an old library book, as you can see, but it was one of their discards that they put on sale, so it's not one that I never gave back. So Mary Stewart was very, very good at writing romantic suspense novels, mystery and suspense, basically. I think this one, I've included this one in this list because it does have a kind of gothic overtone. The main character is an English governess called Linda Martin, who has taken on the job of governess for a French family to a remote chateau in the French Alps to look after and educate the young Philippe de Valmy, who is being brought up by his uncle and aunt. Now, this grand chateau in the French Alps has a pretty gothic feel, and when Linda arrives there, she feels a kind of disturbing atmosphere in this chateau as well. So it has that kind of dark overtone in that sense. But as the book goes on, she begins to suspect that there is some murderous plot going on. The boy Philippe is due to inherit the chateau and its estate, and she begins to suspect that Leon, his uncle, has a plan to take over the estate himself. And she also meets the uncle's son, Raoul, who she suspects also may be involved in this plot. So, as with usual with Mary Stuart, there is this growing sense of danger and fear and threat. And she finds herself in the position of having to take care of this boy and try and foil this plot that becomes ever more dangerous. And also, what I like about Mary Stuart is she always begins her chapters with a quote, a literature quote, often Shakespeare, often Dickens, and they kind of give you a feel at the beginning of each chapter. In particular, this one at the beginning of chapter 8, from Shakespeare's King John. Thou art more deep damned than Prince Lucifer. There is not yet so ugly a fiend of hell as thou shalt be if thou didst kill this child. So there you go. That sets up the kind of theme and atmosphere. So it's not supernatural. It's not ghosts or vampires or witches. It's just dark Gothic suspense. So if you don't like your horror full of the supernatural, then you might like to try this one. Hello, I've got a little visitor. Hello, sweetie. So my next book is again with the theme of Dracula, and I've got another one that does that as well. This one was published in 2005, and it's The Historian by Elizabeth Kostover. While it's not an actual horror story, it is quite eerie and creepy and dark. The narrator of the book starts off where she finds an old book which appears to be associated with Dracula. She discusses this book with her father, who says that he had found it when he was a student, and he discussed it with his mentor, Professor Bartholomew Rossi. And he had found a similar book and had researched the whole myth of Dracula and, of course, the history of Vlad the Impaler, of course, who Dracula is actually based on. Rossi, after researching Vlad the Impaler and the Dracula myth, comes to the belief that Dracula is still alive. So the narrator becomes interested herself, and she and her father travel across Europe and try to find the tomb of Dracula or Vlad the Impaler and investigate this whole myth. So the whole book interweaves this, the whole history and myth surrounding Vlad the Impaler and Dracula. And it's not lunchtime yet, no. And it also goes back in time to the narrator's father when he himself was also carrying out various searches. So it's both a novel of investigation, it's interweaves history. It also investigates the lore and myth of the vampire, the Ottoman Empire, the Romanian countryside. So all that, but it's not actually a horror story in itself. But of course, because of the subject matter, it does have these very Gothic dark overtones and really explores the psychology too behind the whole myth of Dracula. So it's a very well researched, interesting book to read if you are fascinated by the whole theme of vampires, Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, etc. If you love all that stuff, then you really should read The Historian. When I read this, I think possibly I was expecting a little more horror from it and supernatural. So I was possibly a little bit disappointed that it wasn't as chilling and suspenseful as I hoped it was going to be. Maybe I was expecting too much from that side of it, but as a historical investigation, it's really, really fascinating, and I did enjoy it in that sense. So there you go, The Historian by Elizabeth Costover. My next book, published in 2012, is a book that I read last year around, it was just after Christmas and into the new year. And it is set kind of at that time of the year, but it's also a good book to read at Halloween because it's really creepy, full of magic and dark magic at that. And this is Advent by James Treadwell. I could not get enough of this book, and I was really, really surprised when I look at it on Goodreads that it doesn't have that high a rating by other readers. It seems to polarize people. People either love it or hate it. I loved it. As soon as I finished it, I went and ordered the second in the trilogy, which I am yet to read. Advent is the main character is a boy called Gavin, who just seems to be at first an ordinary kid, lives in the city with his parents who don't particularly like him, but he sees things and knows that no one ever believes him. At the beginning of the story, he is on his way to Cornwall to stay with, I think it's an aunt, and he travels on a train where one of the vision he has of this mysterious woman called Miss Gray, who he has named Miss Gray, also appears to him on the train. And when he gets to his destination in Cornwall, his aunt, who was supposed to meet him, seems to have completely disappeared. And he has to try and make his way to her house. The house is the lodge house of an old stately house. And he has to stay there on his own that night, and very strange things begin to happen. And very disturbing things begin to happen. As the book goes on, Gavin realizes that he has some kind of magic within him. But Harry Potter it ain't. The book is interwoven with the Faustian, a legend. We get flashbacks to that medieval time and this dark magic that has been kept in secret and is now coming out. And as the book goes on, that magic begins to be released. Oh, it gets very, very weird and chilling. And the magic is very dark. And it's very supernatural, and it just surprises you all the time, this author, because you're turning the page and you just don't know what is going to happen next. It's like almost anything can happen. And I think that's what makes it, for me, completely compelling reading and utterly mesmerizing. I don't understand anybody who said, I've read reviews and people say the book's too slow, it's too detailed. I just completely disagree. I just found it really, although it's a big read, it ended too quickly for me. So, as I say, it seems to polarize people, but I don't really know why. I think it's excellently written. If you like horror, if you like books with magic, especially dark magic, if you like feeling chilled and scared and just want to feel that thrill of the supernatural, then I would say this is very much the book for you, and I 100% recommend it. Now, my next book, published in 2014, is the book I read at Halloween last year. And oh gosh, it's it's Revival by Stephen King. And what can I say? Stephen King is such a good writer and such a compelling writer and a page-turning writer, despite the fact that although, you know, there are intense moments, obviously, in his books and horrific moments, there's and I haven't read much Stephen King, I have to say, but from what I know, much of his plots involve quite mundane, everyday happenings, and he has an ability to write about the everyday, which is still incredibly intriguing and page-turning, which is a very clever thing to do, but always with that sort of underlying sense of unease. Now, if you haven't read Revival, it starts off with the main character as a young boy. He lives in a, I think, small town parish in Maine, and a new minister comes to their church who, the main character, Charles, develops quite a close relationship with him. And when Charles's brother loses his voice after an accident, the minister is able to heal him with some sort of electrical device. He seems to be very, very popular. Everybody likes this minister. He seems to be a very kind man. But then something really horrific happens, and the minister's wife and child are killed in a horrendous car accident. And after this, the minister seems to completely denounce God and religion. And so everybody turns against him and he leaves the parish. In the meantime, Charles grows up, and but as a teenager, he starts to get heavily into drugs and heroin. So his life sort of takes a rather bad turn. But every so often, the minister, Jacobs, turns up in his life, and he finds later on that Jacobs is kind of performing as a sort of faith healer, using electricity again to heal people. And he actually helps Charles again and helps him get over his drug addiction. Seems all well and good, but Charles begins to discover that other people who have been healed by Jacobs have very strange side effects, very disturbing side effects. And he kind of starts to investigate this. I'll go no further, because this really, really builds up and builds up. And, you know, quite a lot of the time, you know, apart from that horrendous accident and sort of unease in the book, you know, this isn't too bad. It's not real horror until you get to the end. I'm not going to say any more than that. It's really very, very scary and disturbing at the end. So you have been warned. But, you know, it's Stephen King, and he's just such an intriguing writer. That is an extraordinary thing to do for a writer of horror, to give you this story that doesn't really feel like a horror story until right at the end, and yet keep you reading. It's so clever. I think he does it with this underlying feeling of unease. I think the main character being a drug addict kind of helps that. but you know also that this man is going to keep turning up in his life, and there is something not quite right about him. So you kind of keep reading. You always know something is going to happen, and it does. It's just so clever. And he references in this, I think, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the use of electricity, not exactly like he's not creating a monster in that sort of sense, but it's that use of electricity and the kind of madness of this guy who is kind of obsessed with electricity and what it can do. So it's extraordinary novel. I am definitely reading more Stephen King. I've got one in my TBR lined up at some point, and I do want to read more because he's just, I don't know, what is it about his writing? He creates interest all the time, and maybe that's why his horror writing is so horrific, because he writes about the mundane, so we see ourselves, these everyday things, and we see ourselves there. So we relate to the main characters and the characters around very strongly, so that the horror, when it comes, is more intensely horrific because it just feels very personal. Well, that's my theory anyway about how he is such a good horror writer. I'd love to hear your views too. Anyway, that's one Stephen King that I really loved. It's called Revival. My last book on this list is another book that references Dracula, this time co-written by Bram Stoker's great-grandnephew, Dacre Stoker. And this is Dracul by Dacre Stoker and J.D. Barker. Very, very chilling and very dark. And this is a really interesting novel because Dacre Stoker, as a relative of Bram Stoker, had access to all of Bram Stoker's notes and journals. And he based this novel on some of Bram Stoker's notes on Dracula and some of the original chapters and preface to the book that never got published. The main character in the novel is Bram Stoker himself. And the book opens with him barricaded inside Whitby Abbey. I visited Whitby Abbey earlier this year, summer, under a thunderstorm. It was wonderful. It takes us straight into real fear and terror, like something is outside the door, and he is writing his journals and telling about his childhood. So we go back to Bram Stoker's childhood at a time where he spent a lot of his childhood bedridden. He was quite a sickly child. He and his brothers and sisters nanny called Ellen Crone, who they became suspicious of after a series of strange deaths in a nearby town. Later on, after he is mysteriously healed from his sickness, she disappears, and he and his sister go off to try and investigate her and discover that she has some connection to Dracula. Now, this is all from Bram Stoker's notes, actual real notes. And he has taken all that and put that into this really, really scary novel. What is also interesting and pretty spine-chilling as well is that when Bram Stoker originally wrote Dracula, he wrote a preface saying this: "I am quite convinced that there is no doubt whatever that the events here described really took place. However unbelievable and incomprehensible they might appear at first sight." his publisher wouldn't allow him to publish the book with that preface in it, so he took it out. So this novel is based on all those notes Bram Stoker made about Dracula and turns this into a real horror story with Bram Stoker as the main character. It's quite extraordinary. It is very scary. It's very gothic. You know, it's Whitby Abbey, probably the most gothic places I've ever visited, especially under a thunderstorm. And I think it's a really good book to end this list. I'll just read the back. It's very difficult to actually sum this book up, so I'll just read the back. It is 1868. 21-year-old Bram Stoker has barricaded himself inside the tower of a long-abandoned abbey. He is armed with mirrors and crucifixes, holy water, some white roses, a notebook, and a gun. His only solace is a bottle of brandy. His fervent prayer is that he will survive the night. Time is short. Determined to leave a record of what he has witnessed, the young man begins to write, and the tale he tells is an extraordinary one. For on the other side of that locked door waits an ungodly nightmare that he had hoped had ended years before. Speculation still surrounds what was in the missing first 100 pages of the original Dracula. Inspired by the notebooks and journals Bram Stoker left behind, Dracul takes us back to the very beginning to reveal what drove him to write one of the most terrifying stories ever told. So, interesting, eh? What do you make of that? I really do recommend this one. I must get round to getting that yellow label off at some point. And if you really want a chilling Halloween type story. Whew, so there we are. That is my list of recommended stories for Halloween. I hope you enjoyed that list. I think it's quite a nice list, don't you? Here she is. You need a cuddle after all that, eh? Yeah, it was a bit scary, wasn't it? Yeah, I'm quite pleased with that little list. So I hope you find something in there that will hit just the right note for what you like to read at Halloween. I'm currently reading The Terror by Dan Simmons. That is my Halloween read, and it's going to take me a long time to get through it. So I don't know when I'll be reviewing that. But, of course, as I said, my reading of Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde will be coming up in 3 parts in the 3 weeks leading up to Halloween. So we've got that to look forward to as well. And next week, being the 75th anniversary of the first publication of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, I'm going to have a little bit of a deep dive into Narnia. So I'm really looking forward to that one, and I hope you will too. Let me out of here. Come here, Tilly. That's it. Come on. She's always ready for her dinner, even when it's not dinner time, aren't you? Yeah. So that's it from me. And let me know what you think of those books I've just been talking about. I will see you again next week for a journey through Narnia. Take care, everyone, and see you soon. Bye for now.